The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Kiza of the Valerian Empire stood before the assembly. Her silver skin shimmered under the artificial lights, and her four eyes surveyed the crowd with calculated precision. The war had lasted 3 solar cycles, and her people were exhausted. The humans, those strange two-eyed creatures from the outer rim, had proven far more resilient than anyone anticipated. "I propose a union," Kiza announced, her voice carrying the weight of her decision. "A marriage between myself and a human representative. A bond of peace." The chamber erupted in protest and gasps. Marriage was sacred among the Valerians, a biological and spiritual connection that could never be broken. To offer it to an alien species was unprecedented. "His name is Nick," she continued, silencing the crowd. "A decorated soldier, a diplomat, and from what I understand, a man of honor." What Kiza didn't mention was her true calculation. Humans were weak, physically unremarkable compared to most species. They lacked the Valerians' enhanced strength, the Krothans' armored hides, or the Zeniths' telepathic abilities. This marriage would be symbolic, nothing more. The humans would feel honored, and the war would end. She was wrong. The ceremony took place on neutral ground, aboard the orbital station Concordia. Nick stood at the altar in formal human attire, a simple black suit that seemed almost primitive compared to the elaborate robes of the alien dignitaries. He was tall for a human, with dark hair and eyes that held an unsettling depth. When Kiza approached, he smiled, a strange human gesture she'd studied but never quite understood. "Ambassador Kiza," he said, his voice steady, "I accept this union with humility and hope." She repeated the Valerian vows, feeling the biological bond begin to form. It was instantaneous and overwhelming, a connection that would allow them to sense each other's emotions, share strength in times of need. She felt his presence in her mind, calm, resolute, and surprisingly gentle. The peace treaty was signed. The war was over. For 6 months, Kiza and Nick lived together on Concordia, learning each other's cultures. He was patient with her, teaching her about human literature, music, and history. She found herself drawn to his curiosity, his endless questions about the universe. But she still saw him as fragile, a creature whose species had only barely survived their own planetary conflicts. Then the Devourers came. The Devourers were a nightmare given form. They'd swept through the outer galaxies, consuming everything in their path. No species had ever stopped them. The Galactic Council received the distress signal on a quiet morning. The Devourers had entered their space. Panic spread like wildfire. The Council convened emergency sessions. Military fleets mobilized, and everyone knew deep in their hearts that they were facing extinction. Kiza found Nick in their quarters, staring at a holographic display of the Devourer fleet. His expression was unreadable. "They'll be here in 48 hours, she said, her voice trembling despite her training. "The Council is evacuating non-essential personnel. We should—" "No," Nick interrupted quietly. She felt it through their bond, not fear, but something else. Something ancient and primal. "Nick, we can't fight them." "No one has ever." "That's because no one has ever been desperate enough." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her step back. "Kiza, I need you to trust me, and I need you to convince the Council to give me full military command." "That's insane. You're one human." "I'm one human who knows what my species is capable of when everything is on the line." His jaw tightened. "We don't have enhanced strength or armor or telepathy. But we have something else. Something your people have never needed to develop." "What?" "Spite." The Council was reluctant, but with time running out and no alternatives, they granted Nick emergency command. What happened next would be recorded in galactic history for millennia. Nick didn't rely on superior technology or firepower. Instead, he studied the Devourers' patterns, their biology, their single-minded hunger. And then he did something no alien commander had ever considered. He made them angry. Using automated ships loaded with biological irritants, compounds that wouldn't harm the Devourers but would drive them into a frenzy. He turned their own nature against them. The fleet followed the automated ships into the heart of a dying star system, where Nick had positioned gravity mines throughout the asteroid field. But that wasn't enough. The Devourers were adapting, beginning to scatter. That's when Nick did the unthinkable. He piloted a ship directly into their flagship, a massive bioorganic vessel, and detonated the station's entire antimatter reserve, which he'd secretly loaded into his cargo bay. Through their bond, Kiza felt his determination, his acceptance of death. his fierce love for her and every living being counting on him. She screamed, feeling the explosion through their connection. But Nick didn't die. At the last second, he'd ejected in an escape pod, using the explosion's shockwave to slingshot himself clear. The Devourer flagship was obliterated, and without their command structure, the remaining ships fell into chaos. The combined galactic fleet, following Nick's precise coordinates, swept in and finished what he'd started. When Kiza found him in the medical bay, recovering from radiation exposure and multiple fractures, she couldn't speak. She simply held his hand, feeling through their bond what she'd always missed. The indomitable will that had allowed humanity to survive ice ages, plagues, wars, and their own worst instincts. "Your species," she whispered finally, "are terrifying." Nick laughed weakly. "We're survivors. We're stubborn. And when you threaten the people we love," his eyes met hers, "we become unstoppable." The Galactic Council offered Nick the highest military honor. He declined, saying he only wanted to return home with his wife. But the message had been received across 1,000 worlds. Humanity wasn't strong because of their bodies or their technology. They were strong because they refused to surrender even when surrender was logical. They were strong because they could stare into the abyss and spit in its face. They were strong because more than any other species they understood that sometimes survival isn't about power, it's about will. Kiza learned that day what it truly meant to be human, and as she stood beside Nick, watching the stars from their quarters, she realized her marriage hadn't been symbolic at all. It had been the smartest decision she'd ever made.